Japan's story begins in a land of mountains, forests, and islands rising from the Pacific. Surrounded by seas that both protected and isolated it, Japan developed a culture distinct from its Asian neighbors, yet deeply influenced by them. The rugged terrain limited farmland, encouraging communities to settle in fertile valleys and coastal plains. Over time, these communities grew into powerful clans that would shape Japan's destiny. For centuries, Japan looked outward to its neighbors for inspiration. From China, it borrowed writing, Buddhism, philosophy, and models of government. From Korea came artisans, scholars, and new technologies that enriched Japan's early courts. Yet Japan never became a mirror of these civilizations. Instead, it absorbed outside influences and reshaped them into something uniquely Japanese. By the late 8th century, a new era was beginning. In 794, the imperial court moved its capital to Heian-kyo, known today as Kyoto. This marked the start of the Heian period, a time remembered for refinement and elegance. Aristocrats at the imperial court devoted themselves to poetry, calligraphy, and the pursuit of beauty. Noble women kept diaries that remain among the most treasured works of Japanese literature. The Tale of Genji, written by Lady Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century, is often described as the world's first novel, capturing the subtleties of love, politics, and courtly intrigue. The court was a place of ceremony and ritual. Clothing carried meaning, with layers of silk robes that revealed a person's status and taste. Gardens were designed to mirror the natural world in miniature. Aristocrats competed in poetry contests, where the ability to capture fleeting moments of emotion in just a few lines was considered a mark of refinement. In these golden centuries of Heian culture, power seemed firmly in the hands of the imperial family and their noble allies. Yet beneath this surface of elegance, the authority of the emperor was weakening. Local aristocrats and temples owned vast estates in the countryside. Over time, the imperial court struggled to control these distant lands. Governors sent from the capital often lacked the power to enforce order, while provincial landowners grew increasingly independent. This slow erosion of central power opened the door for a new class of men whose strength lay not in poetry or ceremony, but in the mastery of arms. These were the bushi, the warriors who would later be known as the samurai. At first, they were hired by wealthy landowners to defend estates from bandits or rival clans. Over time, they became more than hired guards. They developed their own codes of loyalty and formed lasting bonds with the lords they served. Their way of life emphasized skill in mounted archery, swordsmanship, and discipline in battle. While the court in Kyoto still celebrated elegance, out in the provinces, the future of Japan was being shaped by men who lived by the bow and the blade. The rise of the samurai was tied to the land itself. Japan's rugged geography often left villages isolated, vulnerable to raids and conflicts. As local magnates consolidated power, they relied on warriors to defend their holdings. The bonds of service between lord and retainer became the foundation of feudal Japan. Loyalty was rewarded with land or stipends, while betrayal was punished with dishonor or death. In this crucible of conflict, the ideals of the samurai began to take shape. As the warriors grew in power, rivalries among clans began to dominate Japanese politics. The most famous of these were the Minamoto and the Taira, two great families whose fortunes rose in the late Heian period. Both clans traced their lineage back to imperial princes, giving them an aura of legitimacy. They built networks of alliances with other warrior families across the provinces, each seeking influence at the imperial court. By the 12th century, the court's authority had weakened so much that real power shifted into the hands of these warrior clans. The Taira family gained prominence by supporting the court and securing key positions in government. Their leader, Taira no Kiyomori, rose to become one of the most powerful men in Japan, even marrying his daughters into the imperial family. For a time, the Taira seemed destined to dominate the country, yet the Minamoto remained strong, and tension between the two families grew. Their rivalry would soon explode into open conflict, plunging Japan into the Genpei War at the end of the 12th century. The outcome of this struggle would forever alter the balance of power, establishing the samurai not just as protectors of landowners, but as the true rulers of Japan. The dawn of feudal Japan, then, is a story of contrasts. At the court in Heian-kyo, noble families composed poetry, painted delicate screens, and built temples that still stand today. In the countryside, warriors trained with sword and bow, bound by loyalty to their lords and ready to shed blood in their service. Out of these tensions emerged a new social order, one in which the warrior class would rise above all others. This first chapter sets the stage for the centuries that followed. Japan was moving away from the elegant but fragile authority of the court and toward an era dominated by the discipline, valor, and ambitions of the samurai. The next chapters will trace how this warrior class, born from provincial struggles, came to shape the destiny of a nation. The twilight years of the Heian period were filled with growing unrest. While aristocrats still recited poetry in the halls of Kyoto, the countryside was dominated by warriors who had risen to prominence. The Minamoto and the Taira families stood as the two greatest of these clans. Both traced their descent from imperial bloodlines, yet both had forged their power far from the ceremonial center of the capital. Their rivalry would ignite one of the most famous conflicts in Japanese history, the Genpei War. The Genpei War began in 1180, when Prince Mochihito, a member of the imperial family, called upon the Minamoto to overthrow the Taira, who had seized influence at court. At the time, the Taira, under their leader Kiyomori, had married into the imperial family and effectively ruled the throne through child emperors. Their dominance was resented, and the Minamoto seized the chance to rally support. Soon, the land was divided as samurai pledged their loyalty to one side or the other. The war raged for 5 years. Battles were fought on land and sea, with both clans seeking to prove their supremacy. Among the Minamoto, the figure of Minamoto no Yoshitsune became legendary. Known for his brilliance as a general, Yoshitsune won key victories that turned the tide of the war. His use of daring tactics, such as surprise attacks and night raids, brought him fame and cemented his place in Japan's warrior lore. The climax of the conflict came in 1185 at the Battle of Dan no Ura. Fought on the waters of the inland sea, it was a naval clash between the fleets of the Taira and the Minamoto. The Taira at first held the advantage, but shifting tides and betrayal among their allies doomed them. As defeat became certain, many of the Taira nobles threw themselves into the sea, including the young Emperor Antoku, who was only a child. With the destruction of the Taira, the Minamoto emerged victorious. From this victory, a new order arose. Minamoto no Yoritomo, Yoshitsune's elder brother, became the most powerful man in Japan. In 1192, he was granted the title of shogun, establishing the Kamakura shogunate. Though the emperor remained a sacred figure, the real authority now rested with the shogun, a military ruler backed by the strength of the samurai. This marked the beginning of Japan's feudal age, in which power was decentralized, yet firmly rooted in the bonds between lords and their warrior retainers. Under the Kamakura shogunate, the ideals of the samurai began to take shape. Service to one's lord was held above all else. The bond of loyalty was not a matter of simple employment, but of honor and obligation. To serve faithfully was to embody the spirit of the warrior. To fail in duty brought disgrace not only upon the individual, but upon their family and descendants. Martial valor, discipline, and skill with weapons were cultivated as the highest virtues. The sword, the bow, and the spear became extensions of the samurai's identity. Yet their role was not limited to fighting. Samurai acted as administrators, enforcing order and protecting the lands of their lords. They became both warriors and stewards, bound by codes of conduct that slowly developed into what would later be known as bushidō, the way of the warrior. The Kamakura era also tested the unity and resolve of the samurai in ways no one could have anticipated. In the 13th century, Japan faced a threat unlike any before. Across the seas, the Mongol Empire had risen under Genghis Khan and his descendants. By the 1270s, the empire stretched from China to the edges of Europe. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, demanded that Japan submit to his rule. The Kamakura shogunate refused, and invasion became inevitable. The first Mongol invasion came in 1274. A fleet carrying tens of thousands of soldiers crossed from Korea to the shores of Kyushu. The samurai, trained in individual combat, were unprepared for the Mongol style of warfare. The invaders fought in tight formations, using coordinated volleys of arrows and explosives unknown in Japan. Despite being driven back at first, the Mongols gained ground. Yet as night fell, a sudden storm swept through the sea. Many of the invaders' ships were destroyed, and the survivors were forced to retreat. The Japanese credited their salvation to divine favor. 7 years later, the Mongols returned with an even larger fleet, determined to conquer Japan once and for all. The samurai had spent years preparing coastal defenses, building walls and fortifications along the shoreline. Once again, fierce battles erupted as Mongol forces landed. For weeks the fighting dragged on, yet fate intervened once more. Another massive storm struck, scattering and wrecking the enemy fleet. The invasion collapsed, and Japan was saved. These storms were remembered as kamikaze, the divine winds. To the Japanese, they were signs of heavenly protection. The Mongol invasions became a powerful symbol of unity, proving that when the samurai fought together, they could defend their homeland against the mightiest empire in the world. Yet the victories also carried challenges. The cost of defense had drained the resources of the Kamakura shogunate, and because the Mongols had been repelled rather than conquered, there were no new lands or spoils to reward loyal warriors. This sowed seeds of discontent that would eventually weaken the shogunate. Even so, the Mongol invasions became a defining moment in the identity of the samurai, binding their destiny to the protection of Japan itself. The centuries that followed, the Genpei War and the Mongol invasions, were transformative. The samurai were no longer merely protectors of local estates. They were the pillars of a new political order, men whose loyalty and valor upheld the shogunate and defended the nation. Their ideals of service, honor, and discipline, forged in times of triumph and trial, began to shape not only the lives of warriors, but the culture of Japan itself. The ascent of the samurai was now complete. From the ashes of the Taira, through the rise of the Kamakura shogunate, and against the storms that shattered Mongol fleets, the samurai had proven themselves as the guardians of Japan. What began as a class of provincial warriors had become the ruling force of an entire nation. The fall of the Kamakura shogunate in 1333 marked the end of Japan's first military government, yet the power vacuum it left behind did not restore lasting strength to the imperial throne. Instead, Japan entered an era of shifting alliances, rival shoguns and bitter rivalries that would fracture the nation for centuries. At the heart of this turmoil stood the Ashikaga family, who established the next shogunate in 1336. The Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi period, was born out of conflict. Ashikaga Takauji, a former general of the Kamakura regime, turned against his masters and seized control of Kyoto. Declaring himself shogun, he claimed the authority to rule in the emperor's name. Yet unlike the Kamakura shoguns, whose power rested on firm warrior networks, the Ashikaga struggled to maintain control. Their authority extended mainly over the capital and its surroundings, while distant provinces increasingly followed their own paths. This weakness created constant instability. Powerful samurai families often switched loyalties between the shogunate and the imperial court. Some fought to strengthen the Ashikaga, while others supported a rival line of emperors in what became known as the Northern and Southern Courts period. For half a century, Japan lived with two competing courts, each claiming legitimacy. Eventually, the Ashikaga triumphed, but their authority remained fragile, dependent on the cooperation of regional lords. Despite this fragility, the Ashikaga era produced remarkable cultural achievements. The shoguns became patrons of the arts, embracing Zen Buddhism and the aesthetics of simplicity and stillness. It was during this period that ink painting flourished, capturing landscapes with minimal brushstrokes that suggested more than they revealed. The restrained beauty of Zen gardens, carefully arranged with rocks, moss, and raked gravel, became symbols of harmony between nature and human design. No theater, a highly stylized form of drama, blended poetry, dance, and music to explore themes of memory, longing, and the supernatural. These cultural forms would remain enduring legacies of the period, even as the political order around them crumbled. The greatest crisis of the Ashikaga shogunate came in the mid-15th century. In 1467, the Onin War erupted in Kyoto. What began as a dispute over the succession of the shogunate spiraled into a wider conflict between rival daimyo or feudal lords. For 10 years, battles raged through the capital, reducing much of Kyoto to ruins. Temples, palaces, and homes were destroyed, and the authority of the Ashikaga was shattered beyond repair. When the fighting finally ended in 1477, the city lay devastated, and Japan entered one of its darkest and most violent ages. This new era was known as the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. Lasting for more than a century, it was a time when central authority collapsed completely. Daimyo across the country ruled their domains like independent states, waging constant wars for territory and power. Samurai pledged loyalty to their lords, but that loyalty was often tested. Shifting allegiances, betrayals, and sudden changes of fortune became the rhythm of the age. Yet the Sengoku period was not only about chaos. It was also a crucible in which legendary figures arose. Warlords such as Takeda Shingen, Uesugi Kenshin, and Oda Nobunaga became household names, remembered for their tactical brilliance, personal charisma, and unrelenting ambition. Battles were fought with increasing scale and ferocity as new tactics and technologies, including the introduction of firearms in the 16th century, transformed the art of war. Castles rose across the countryside, not just as fortresses, but as centers of administration and symbols of power. The life of the samurai in this era was one of constant readiness. Peace was rare, and survival often depended on the ability to fight for one's lord while navigating the treacherous politics of shifting alliances. To live and die with loyalty was the ideal, but in practice, survival sometimes demanded betrayal. The contradictions of loyalty and ambition gave the period its distinctive tension. Amid the bloodshed, culture did not wither. On the contrary, it often flourished under the patronage of warlords who sought to display their refinement alongside their power. The tea ceremony, shaped by Zen ideals of simplicity and humility, became a way for samurai and nobles alike to cultivate inner discipline. Ink painting and calligraphy reached new heights, while no theater continued to thrive, offering audiences moments of reflection on the fleeting nature of life in an age of turmoil. Even gardens and architecture reflected the duality of the time, blending serenity with the shadow of war. The Sengoku era revealed the complexity of the samurai spirit. They were both ruthless warriors and patrons of beauty, capable of devastation on the battlefield, yet drawn to the refinement of art and philosophy. Their lives stood at the intersection of violence and culture, bound by the code of service to their lords, but often caught in the shifting tides of war and betrayal. By the end of the 15th century, Japan had become a patchwork of warring states. The Ashikaga shogunate still existed in name, but it no longer commanded real authority. The emperor remained a symbolic figure, but his court held little influence. Power lay entirely in the hands of the daimyo and their samurai armies. The land was fractured, the people weary of endless battles, and yet from this crucible of strife, the stage was set for a new generation of leaders who would seek to bring unity to Japan. The story of the Sengoku Jidai is one of contrasts. It was an age of devastation, but also one of creativity. It was a time of shifting loyalties, but also of legendary warriors who embodied ideals of courage and honor. Out of the chaos, new forms of art, theater, and spiritual practice took root, leaving a legacy that still defines Japanese culture today. As Japan moved deeper into this age of war, the samurai became more than guardians of lords or enforcers of order. They became the decisive actors in shaping the fate of the nation, their swords and their loyalties determining the rise and fall of entire domains. War, loyalty, and betrayal were the fabric of their world, and from it emerged the heroes, tragedies, and cultural treasures that would shape Japan for centuries to come. By the mid-16th century, Japan had been torn apart by more than 100 years of civil war. The Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, had fractured the land into dozens of domains, each ruled by powerful daimyo with their own samurai armies. Alliances shifted constantly, and peace seemed like a distant dream. Out of this chaos arose three extraordinary leaders who would bring the long era of conflict to an end. They are remembered as the great unifiers of Japan. The first was Oda Nobunaga. Born in 1534 as the son of a minor daimyo, Nobunaga inherited his father's lands in Owari province. At first, few could have predicted his rise. Nobunaga was considered eccentric in his youth, often dismissing social conventions. Yet behind his unconventional manner was a mind of ruthless ambition and strategic genius. He set his sights on unifying Japan, and nothing would stand in his way. Nobunaga's rise to power was marked by bold innovations. He was among the first Japanese warlords to recognize the potential of firearms. Portuguese traders had introduced muskets to Japan in the 1540s, and Nobunaga saw at once that they could change the nature of battle. At the Battle of Nagashino in 1575, his forces famously used rotating lines of arquebusiers to devastating effect, breaking the feared cavalry of the Takeda clan. The victory marked a turning point in Japanese warfare, proving that discipline and technology could overcome traditional strength. Nobunaga was not only a master of the battlefield, but also a shrewd political strategist. He weakened Buddhist warrior monks who had resisted samurai power for centuries, crushing their strongholds to remove any rival authority. He centralized administration in the areas he conquered, rewarding loyalty and punishing defiance. His rule was harsh, yet it laid the foundations for stability in lands long accustomed to endless war. By the time of his death in 1582, Nobunaga had brought much of central Japan under his control. He did not live to complete his dream, but his vision of a unified nation would be carried forward by one of his most trusted generals. That general was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. His story is one of the most remarkable in Japanese history. Born in 1537 to a peasant family, Hideyoshi rose from humble beginnings to become the supreme ruler of Japan. He began his career as a low-ranking servant in Nobunaga's army, but quickly distinguished himself with his intelligence, charisma, and ability to command loyalty. Nobunaga promoted him steadily, and after his master's sudden death in 1582, Hideyoshi moved swiftly to claim leadership. Through a mixture of diplomacy, cunning, and military might, Hideyoshi subdued rival warlords and extended his control across the entire country. By 1590, after the surrender of the Hojo clan in the east, he had achieved what no one had managed for centuries: the unification of Japan under a single ruler. His authority, though not formally recognized as shogun due to his common birth, was absolute in practice. Hideyoshi's rule transformed Japanese society. He ordered comprehensive land surveys that measured every field and village, creating an accurate system of taxation. To secure the power of the samurai class, he enacted the famous sword hunts, confiscating weapons from peasants and forbidding anyone outside the warrior class from bearing arms. This solidified the samurai as a distinct and privileged class, separate from farmers, artisans, and merchants. The social order of feudal Japan became more rigid, and the samurai stood at its peak. During this time, the code of the samurai, which had long been practiced in spirit, began to take a more formal shape. The ideals of bushidō, the way of the warrior, emphasized loyalty to one's lord, honor in conduct, and readiness to sacrifice one's life when duty required. Although bushidō would not be fully codified until later centuries, under Hideyoshi and his successors, it became an expected standard of behavior. The samurai were no longer simply fighters. They were guardians of a moral and social order that extended beyond the battlefield. Yet Hideyoshi's ambitions did not end with the unification of Japan. In the 1590s, he turned his gaze outward, seeking to extend his power beyond the seas. In 1592, he launched a massive invasion of Korea, with tens of thousands of samurai crossing the waters to the Korean peninsula. At first, the Japanese forces advanced quickly, capturing key cities. The samurai, seasoned by decades of civil war, fought with determination and skill, but the campaign soon faltered. Korean resistance, aided by the intervention of China's Ming dynasty, proved formidable. Naval battles, led by the Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin, disrupted Japanese supply lines with innovative use of armored turtle ships. The war dragged on for years, draining resources and lives. A second invasion in 1597 achieved little more, and by the time of Hideyoshi's death in 1598, the campaign was abandoned. Despite the failure abroad, Hideyoshi's rule within Japan left a lasting legacy. He completed the process Nobunaga had begun, bringing peace to a country long ravaged by war. He established a clear social hierarchy, centralized control, and ensured the dominance of the samurai as a ruling class. His story, rising from peasant origins to supreme leader, remains one of the most dramatic examples of social mobility in Japanese history. The age of the great unifiers was a turning point for Japan. Through Nobunaga's ruthless innovations and Hideyoshi's sweeping reforms, the centuries of fractured warlord rule were brought to an end. The ideals of the samurai crystallized into a disciplined code that bound them to service, honor, and duty. Yet this age was not only about war and politics. Under the unifiers, art and culture continued to flourish. Castles became both military, fortresses, and symbols of authority, often adorned with golden screens and refined interiors. The tea ceremony, guided by Zen principles of simplicity and mindfulness, became a central expression of refinement, even among hardened warriors. By the end of the 16th century, Japan stood united under strong leadership for the first time in generations. The samurai, once provincial warriors bound to local lords, had become the guardians of a nation, their identity shaped by loyalty and discipline as much as by martial skill. Though Hideyoshi's death left questions about succession and the future of Japan, the groundwork had been laid for the next chapter. A new leader would soon rise, one who would bring an era of enduring peace. The death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi in 1598 left Japan without a clear successor. Hideyoshi's young son was too small to rule, and the Council of Regents appointed to protect his inheritance quickly fractured. Once again, the question of leadership would be decided on the battlefield. At the center of this struggle stood Tokugawa Ieyasu, a man who had served both Nobunaga and Hideyoshi, waiting patiently for his chance to claim power. Ieyasu was a master of patience and calculation. Born into a minor samurai family, he had survived the dangers of the Sengoku age through caution and careful alliances. By 1600, he was one of the most powerful daimyo in Japan, commanding vast resources and loyal armies. His rivals, loyal to Hideyoshi's family, gathered to oppose him. The stage was set for the decisive conflict that would determine the fate of Japan. The two armies met at Sekigahara in October of 1600. More than 100,000 warriors faced one another in the misty valleys of central Japan. The battle began with fierce fighting, but the outcome was decided not only by strength of arms, but by the shifting loyalties that had long defined samurai warfare. Several lords who had promised to support the Toyotomi cause defected to Ieyasu in the midst of battle. Their betrayal shattered the enemy's position. By the end of the day, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood victorious. This triumph made Ieyasu the undisputed master of Japan. In 1603, he was granted the title of shogun by the emperor, establishing the Tokugawa shogunate. Unlike his predecessors, Ieyasu built a system designed not just for his own rule, but for generations to come. He placed his capital in Edo, a fishing village that would grow into the modern city of Tokyo. From there, he and his descendants would rule Japan for more than 250 years. The Tokugawa era brought peace to a country weary of war. For 2.5 centuries, Japan experienced stability rarely seen in its history. Battles that had once consumed the lives of samurai were replaced by order and administration. The shogunate maintained strict control over the daimyo through a system known as alternate attendance, requiring lords to spend every other year in Edo while leaving their families there as hostages in their absence. This prevented rebellion and kept power firmly in Tokugawa hands. With the establishment of peace, the role of the samurai changed dramatically. No longer constantly called to the battlefield, many became administrators, scholars, and bureaucrats. They collected taxes, managed estates, and enforced laws in service to their daimyo. Their swords remained symbols of their status, but their daily duties often required the pen as much as the blade. The samurai were still revered as the highest class of warriors, but their lives now revolved around governance and service rather than combat. The Tokugawa shogunate imposed a rigid social order that divided society into clear ranks. At the top stood the daimyo and their samurai retainers, the military elite. Below them were peasants who formed the backbone of Japan's agricultural economy. Next came artisans, valued for their skills, and finally merchants, whose wealth often grew but whose social standing remained low. This hierarchy reflected Confucian ideals of duty, loyalty, and stability. Each class had its role, and stepping outside one's station was discouraged. For the samurai, peace brought new challenges. Without constant war, many found it difficult to justify their stipends, which were often paid in rice. As the economy shifted and the merchant class grew wealthier, samurai who had once lived by the sword sometimes struggled to maintain their way of life. Debts and financial hardships became common, creating tension between their honored status and their actual circumstances. Yet if their martial purpose declined, their cultural influence grew. Samurai practiced martial arts not only as preparation for combat, but as disciplines that shaped the mind and spirit. Archery, swordsmanship, and later the study of the spear and other weapons were pursued with ritual precision. Many samurai also turned to the arts of poetry, painting, and calligraphy, finding new ways to express their ideals. The study of Confucian philosophy provided moral guidance, emphasizing loyalty to one's lord, filial duty, and the pursuit of righteousness. During this time, the philosophy of bushidō was refined into a more explicit code. The ideals that had guided warriors for centuries were now expressed in writings, teachings, and traditions. Bushido emphasized absolute loyalty, readiness to die in service, and honor above all. To live without honor was considered worse than death, and the ritual of seppuku, or self-disembowelment, was embraced as a way to preserve one's dignity when failure or disgrace could not be avoided. The samurai became not only guardians of the land, but also of a moral order that demanded sacrifice and discipline. The peace of the Tokugawa era also nurtured culture more broadly. Edo became a thriving city, filled with theaters, shops, and entertainment. While the samurai maintained their austere ideals, the townspeople developed their own vibrant culture of kabuki drama, woodblock prints, and storytelling. In contrast, samurai leaned toward more formal and disciplined pursuits, reflecting their role as stewards of order. The dual worlds of refinement and pleasure existed side by side, each shaping the identity of Japan in different ways. Through all of this, the samurai remained symbols of authority and discipline. Though many no longer fought battles, their image as warriors who embodied loyalty and honor endured. Parents taught their children to respect the samurai spirit, even if the swords they carried were rarely drawn. The peace of the Tokugawa era allowed Japan to grow, prosper, and refine its traditions, but it also carried within it the seeds of change. The transformation of the samurai from battlefield heroes into administrators created tensions that would resurface when Japan once again faced the challenges of a changing world. For now, though, the Tokugawa peace stood as a remarkable achievement. After centuries of strife, Japan had found stability under the firm hand of the shogunate. The samurai, though no longer defined by constant war, had taken on a new role as disciplined stewards of society. Their code of bushidō, sharpened by ideals of loyalty and honor, gave meaning to their place in a world where the sword was often sheathed. The story of the Tokugawa era is one of transformation. The warriors who had risen through bloodshed and battle became the guardians of order and culture. They no longer decided Japan's fate through combat, but through their loyalty, their discipline, and their service. The peace they preserved lasted for more than 2 centuries, shaping the soul of Japan as much as the wars of earlier times had done. For more than 2 centuries, Japan under the Tokugawa shogunate had lived in relative peace. Its borders were closed, its society ordered, and its samurai guardians transformed into stewards of stability. Yet beyond the seas, the world was changing rapidly. Western nations expanded their empires, fueled by industrial power and modern weaponry. Inevitably, Japan's isolation would be broken, and with it, the old order of the samurai would come to an end. The moment of reckoning arrived in 1853, when American warships under Commodore Matthew Perry appeared in Edo Bay. The sight of steam-powered vessels, bristling with modern cannons, shocked the Japanese. Perry carried a demand from the United States. Japan must open its ports to foreign trade. The shogunate, unprepared to resist such force, reluctantly agreed. Treaties were signed that favored Western powers, eroding Japan's sovereignty and exposing the weakness of the Tokugawa regime. The arrival of the West unleashed a wave of unrest within Japan. Many samurai viewed the concessions to foreigners as dishonorable, a betrayal of the nation they were sworn to protect. Others saw in the Western powers a new model of strength that Japan would need to adopt if it were to survive. The shogunate, already weakened by economic strain and political divisions, struggled to maintain its authority. Dissatisfaction grew among the domains, especially those in the southwest, such as Satsuma and Choshu, whose leaders called for the restoration of imperial power. By the late 1860s, conflict erupted. The Boshin War, fought between 1868 and 1869, pitted forces loyal to the shogunate against those rallying behind the emperor. The war was brief but decisive. Modern weapons and the momentum of reform favored the imperial cause. Battles across Japan ended with the fall of Tokugawa power. In 1869, the shogunate was abolished and the emperor was restored to direct rule. This event, known as the Meiji Restoration, marked the birth of a new Japan. With the restoration came sweeping changes. The new Meiji government sought to modernize Japan, adopting Western technology, institutions, and military practices. The samurai, once the backbone of the nation, found themselves increasingly sidelined. In 1873, a national conscription law created an army of commoners trained and equipped with modern firearms. For the first time in centuries, military service was no longer the exclusive domain of the warrior class. The government also moved to abolish the privileges that had set samurai apart. Their stipends, once paid in rice, were gradually converted into government bonds that lost value. The right to wear swords in public, long a symbol of their status, was eventually revoked. The very identity of the samurai was being dismantled, replaced by a modern state where birth no longer determined service. For many former warriors, these changes were devastating. Some adapted, becoming teachers, officials, or entrepreneurs in the new society. Others, however, clung to the ideals of loyalty, honor, and martial valor, unable to accept a world where their place no longer existed. This discontent reached its tragic climax in 1877 with the Satsuma Rebellion. The rebellion was led by Saigo Takamori, one of the most respected samurai of his age and once a key supporter of the Meiji government. Disillusioned by the erosion of samurai values, he gathered thousands of followers in Satsuma, rallying them for one last stand. At first, his forces won victories, fueled by discipline and determination. But they faced the modern army of the Meiji state, equipped with rifles, artillery, and new strategies. The struggle ended in bloodshed. At the Battle of Shiroyama, Saigo and his followers made their final stand. Vastly outnumbered and outgunned, they fought with swords against rifles and cannon fire. When defeat became inevitable, Saigo chose death over capture, ending his life in a manner that preserved his honor. The rebellion was crushed, and with it the last hope of a return to the old order. The fall of the samurai marked the end of a way of life that had defined Japan for centuries. Yet their spirit did not vanish. The ideals of bushidō continued to influence Japanese thought, now woven into the identity of a modern nation. Martial arts evolved from practical combat techniques into disciplines of personal development, practiced by people from all walks of life. The literature and theater of Japan preserved the stories of samurai loyalty, sacrifice, and tragedy. In the 20th century, films and novels carried these tales to the world, sparking a global fascination with the figure of the noble warrior. Even in modern Japan, echoes of the samurai remain. Their values of honor, loyalty and perseverance are remembered not as relics of the past, but as part of a cultural foundation. Across the world, the samurai continue to inspire, their legend carried in stories, images, and ideals that transcend time and place. The end of the samurai was both tragic and transformative. Their swords were set aside, their privileges stripped away, yet their legacy endured in ways even they could not have imagined. What began as a class of provincial warriors in the Heian Age ended as a legend that belongs to all of humanity. Their story reminds us of the impermanence of power, the resilience of ideals, and the enduring allure of those who live and die by a code greater than themselves.